I think that there's a long history of very interesting interaction or development of a classical Persian culture that had a very elaborate systems of law going back thousands of years. And when Shi'ism, when Shiite Islam overlays on Persian culture, it develops a very interesting intellectual tradition. It's kind of the same in Iraq, because Iraq, as the Babylonian Empire, also has a very old legal tradition. In fact, Jewish tradition owes itself to Babylonian tradition, because the Talmudic rabbinic tradition really develops deeply in Babylonia, in Iraq. So this whole area has very elaborate systems of development of law and juridical codes of conduct. And it's seen as having, as opposed to tribal cultures that will have very rigid interpretations going back for ages, but not easy change or interpretation. They're far less cosmopolitan. They're more rigid. And so you have an interesting class of men going back thousands of years in these regions that really do see legal innovation as progressive, as responsive, as flexible, much more so than tribal expressions of Islam in other parts of the Middle East, which could be very rigid, right? So on the one level, there's a long history of interpretation and flexibility. But you have to remember that this is always male, and that in itself has a very definite impact on the legal tradition. It's true in Islam, it's true in Catholicism, it's true in Judaism. But yeah, there appears to be a lot of interesting creativity going on in Persian culture and Islam that you don't see in other parts as much. But it's also happening in other parts of the world. In the world of Islam, the world of Islam is incredibly diverse in terms of things going on in the Middle East versus things going on in other regions, Persian Islam versus Gulf Islam, and so on. But the argument that was raised is that I'd have to take a middle position and say that the long-term insight of Western tradition was, but it goes back to Greek critiques of tyranny as well, is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's a basic insight that went back a couple of thousand years in response to monarchies and systems that didn't have any balance of power. Now, when it comes to religious traditions, on the one hand, religious authority that's flexible is going to have a longer life to it. But it's still always going to be subject to a system that doesn't necessarily have checks and balances. It's true that in a very elaborate legal tradition, like that of the epicenters of Shiite legal thinking in Iraq and in Iran, for example, there are many senior clerics, many senior legal authorities. So on one hand, you could say, this is an elaborate system, give it some life, give it some time. But in comes a cleric by the name of Ayatollah Khomeini with ideas that come from an interesting combination of Shiite thinking and radical thinking in Paris, with an interpretation of Islam that maybe some would consider heretical. But it doesn't matter, because now he's the absolute authority. And many people would consider that the president of Iran today is engaging in an interpretation of Islam that's completely heretical. Others consider that the interpretation of Islam that's going on in Saudi Arabia by the clerics there to be absolutely heretical. And there's not a shred of things that anybody can do about it, because they own half the Middle East. And they have a deal with the Saudi family to support them if no questions are asked. And that deal was ongoing right up until the point that Al-Qaeda targeted the Saudi family and the Saudi authorities. So it is the case that absolute power does corrupt, even within religions. So what happened in the West in terms of a long-term process of saying that the Catholic Church is the sole and exclusive authority of interpretation cannot be healthy for Christianity. It took 1,000 years of heretics and others to come to that conclusion. So in the short term, it is chaos to open up authority to anyone. In the long term, it's perceived as freedom from tyranny. And that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma. It's the dilemma with monarchy. Wouldn't it be great to have monarchies where you have a nice, wonderful king? And if you're lucky, his son is going to be nice too. But what about his grandson, who turns out to be a schizophrenic maniac? And that's that dilemma of history, where you could be a lot more efficient and get a lot more done with a nice king than you could ever get done with corrupt democracy. That's where the votes are bought, by the highest bidder. It'd be much more efficient to have a nice, Oh, I loved President Clinton, and I sit there and I look at the screen sometimes, just to my biases. I say, can't we elect him king? Just have him do this for the rest of his life, and we maybe would have saved thousands and thousands of lives and led the world to an enlightened era and all of that. And that is an enormous temptation, but it's the same thing within organized religion. I'm very tempted by what these muftis want of me to support, but I'm very skeptical at the same time.
But don't you think, in your opinion, that Islam was the strongest during the Caliphate, when they had the Khalifa that, sort of ruled all of the...
That it was stronger?
Yeah.
What does that mean, stronger?
Just overall, just a stronger religion, more unified, just willing to tolerate one another more, as opposed to, arguments within religion. I mean, within that religion.
Well, I think that there was an ongoing struggle, even with the Caliphate, with, there were thousands and thousands of people who were inferior citizens, who didn't have rights that were equal, whether they be women or homosexuals or non-believers or people who are skeptics and so on. So, when you have unity in a political system, it's often at the expense of the minorities. It's just it's a silent war. It's not something that's overt. You can avoid civil war when you have that kind of unity, but there's always the silent, what's going on silently. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk about the role of education, and as both sort of playing to each side, as a way to control people and to limit interpretation, and also as a way to empower people and give them the means to interpret things differently and progressively. Let me rephrase. I wanted you to talk about and to talk about that as it relates to Islamic communities and interpretation of the Quran, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, we can talk about this more next time, but I think that, again, harking back to some of the competing paradigms in the other monotheisms, is that you have two choices. One is that you can rule by authority, political and police authority, and legal systems. Or you can see yourself primarily as an educator of the human spirit. And that really is the choice. And so a number of, and there are political theories that run on that, so that classic liberal theories run on the assumption that education of the individual is the key to freedom and good governance. But if, for example, you think that people are inherently corrupt or evil and they need to be controlled, then you'll have a much more rigid notion of controlling people through an absolute government. And these kind of these attitudes to human nature, vary. Now, in the case of Islam in the future, obviously, faced with enormous social disruption and chaos, people will opt, or there are many religious authorities that would opt for religious authority to be the way in which things are controlled. But I know for a fact, I mean, I've worked with senior clerics from Iran, for example, who are part of the movements that are being persecuted by Khomeini's followers and by very corrupt clerics who've gained absolute power and become extremely wealthy in Iran and are part of this extremely corrupt establishment. And I think I told you last week that one of them read the book I had where I was trying to make a hermeneutic for religious authority that was diverse and pluralistic in terms of governance in one of my books that you'll read later. And he just said to me, well, I don't see why religion should be involved in government at all. So this is coming from the land of Khomeini, because the learning experience of the last 30 years has been such that very religious clerics have concluded that the clerics were corrupted by power, and therefore Islam was corrupted by power. And from the land of Islamic revolution, they are trying to argue for the separation of religion and state. That's a very interesting parallel to the developments of Western history in relationship to religion and power. So when people are free to say this, now a mufti who's a state authority, who's trying to keep a lid on things, whether it be in Bosnia or in Syria, they got a different job on their hands. They're trying to keep Islam from blowing up, from radicals pouring in from everywhere, wanting to blow things up. And they're saying, just give me the authority on who can be in this mosque and who can be in that mosque, and I'll take care of this because these people are crazy. And there's a great temptation to say, you're right, let's work together. But from the land in which religion does have absolute power comes an insight that maybe this isn't such a good thing for organized religion. It's a very interesting. I think we should tease out next time what are the possible paradigms here, and also what are the middle paradigms. Like how do you go from a place of absolute authority to a place of freedom, and still have within you, within your midst, those who want religion to have absolute power and are openly courting devotees and followers from everywhere. What do you do about it? So we'll talk about that next time. Read.